On the morning of March 6, 1970, a 51-year-old heavy equipment operator named Mack Ray Edwards walked into the foothill station of the Los Angeles Police Department and made a statement that would permanently alter the landscape of several long-standing missing persons investigations. He did not ask for a lawyer. He did not attempt to negotiate. Instead, he insisted that he needed to confess to crimes that, up to that moment, had eluded authorities for nearly 2 decades. Officers at the station initially believed this was another case of an individual seeking attention or experiencing a personal crisis. It was not uncommon for law enforcement to receive walk-in confessions that ultimately proved unfounded. Yet, within moments of speaking to Edwards, investigators sensed that this situation was different. His demeanor was calm, measured, and disturbingly matter-of-fact. He explained that he had harmed and killed multiple children beginning in the early 1950s and continuing into the late 1960s. He stated this not with emotional volatility, but with the tone of someone describing a long and burdensome secret. According to the officers present, Edwards mentioned the kidnapping of 3 children in the days leading up to his arrival at the station. 2 had escaped, the 3rd he released. He understood they could identify him, and he therefore chose to turn himself in. When Sergeant George Rock questioned him about why he came forward, Edwards responded with a phrase that would later appear in nearly every retelling of this case: "I have a guilt complex. I couldn't eat, and I couldn't sleep, and it was beginning to affect my work." This was the first indication of a psychological paradox that would challenge investigators, journalists, and criminologists for decades. Voluntary confessions from serial offenders are rare. Even rarer are confessions delivered with such composure and self-directed condemnation. Edwards presented himself not as someone trying to evade responsibility, but as someone demanding accountability. Yet the question that immediately emerged, and still persists today, was whether this confession reflected remorse, a desire for control, or something more complex. As the interview continued, detectives were struck not only by Edwards' calmness, but also by the specificity of his statements. He named victims, he provided approximate years, he described locations where he claimed the bodies would be found. In several instances, these names matched missing children cases that had long frustrated investigators. Law enforcement quickly realized that the man sitting in their interview room might be responsible for crimes far more extensive than initially assumed. Within hours, the LAPD launched a coordinated effort to verify his admissions. Teams revisited old case files, detectives contacted families who had endured years of uncertainty. At the same time, Edwards continued to insist that he wanted no legal defense, no mitigation, and no attempt to lessen the consequences for his actions. He declared repeatedly that he was guilty and that he deserved the death penalty. This insistence became a defining element of the case. Many offenders deny responsibility even in the face of overwhelming evidence. Edwards, instead, seemed intent on amplifying his culpability. Whether this stemmed from genuine moral reckoning or from a desire to control the narrative remains an unresolved question. Criminologists note that some offenders derive a sense of dominance from confession, shaping how their cases are perceived. Others experience a psychological breaking point triggered by personal stressors, leading them to expose years of concealed behavior. For investigators in 1970, however, these debates were secondary to the immediate objective, determining which of Edwards' admissions were factual. His early statements contained both clear details and concerning inconsistencies. Some claims aligned closely with known disappearances. Others were vague, shifting, or contradicted by later accounts he provided while in custody. Yet, despite these inconsistencies, the confession itself represented a pivotal moment. After almost 20 years, authorities finally possessed a potential explanation for several cases once thought unsolvable. Families who had lived with unanswered questions were suddenly confronted with a man claiming to know the fate of their missing children. By the end of that first day, it was evident that this was not simply a confession. It was the opening chapter of one of California's most unsettling criminal investigations. Edwards' statements would lead detectives into decades-old case files, unearth new lines of inquiry, and initiate a process that would continue long after his imprisonment and death. To understand how Mack Ray Edwards evaded detection for nearly 2 decades, investigators had to examine the life he lived outside the interrogation room. On paper, he resembled countless working-class men in mid-century Southern California. A husband, a father, a veteran, and a heavy equipment operator employed on major public works projects. Nothing in his outward behavior matched the profile of someone capable of the crimes he eventually confessed to. Instead, He occupied a space of quiet normalcy, one that allowed him to blend into the suburban landscape of Los Angeles County with disarming ease. Edwards worked for the California Division of Highways, a predecessor to Caltrans, operating heavy machinery on infrastructure projects that would shape the region for decades. The job offered long hours, stable pay, and a degree of trust. Equipment operators were often unsupervised, handling massive earth-moving machinery across rugged and remote areas. Later investigators would question whether these work sites overlapped with locations connected to missing persons cases. While no definitive evidence confirms this, the possibility underscores how occupational access can complicate criminal investigations. Beyond his job, Edwards cultivated an image of reliability and neighborly generosity. He was known for taking local children on camping trips, helping with chores, and offering rides on the horses he kept. Parents in the community described him as polite, patient, and trustworthy. One father, whose daughters were victims in a kidnapping incident that Edwards confessed to, later stated that Edwards had always seemed like a great guy. This contradiction between public persona and hidden behavior is a recurring theme in criminology. Offenders who successfully embed themselves within a community often rely on normalcy as their most effective disguise. His family life further reinforced this perception. Edwards was married and had 2 adopted children. Neighbors recalled routine domestic scenes: a man fixing things in the yard, a family driving together to church, children playing near the house. Nothing outwardly indicated turmoil or instability. For many investigators, this duality raises important questions about behavioral compartmentalization, the psychological ability to maintain a socially acceptable life while engaging in clandestine criminal actions. When journalist Weston DeWalt began researching the disappearance of 8-year-old Tommy Bowman in the early 2000s, he traced Edwards' movements during the period and found a pattern of proximity that was difficult to ignore. DeWalt was struck by how frequently Edwards appeared, directly or indirectly, near the lives of children who later disappeared. Yet, during the 1950s and 60s, communities often operated with a baseline level of trust that left little room for suspicion. Child safety protocols common today, background checks, formal supervision standards, and strict digital record-keeping were not yet widely implemented. Even after Edwards' confession became public, many individuals who had known him struggled to reconcile the man they interacted with and the crimes he admitted to. Criminologists often note that offenders who target minors frequently rely on familiarity and access as critical elements of their behavior. By positioning himself as a helpful neighbor and family man, Edwards built a protective barrier of social credibility. This credibility enabled him to escape scrutiny even when disappearances occurred in communities he frequented. Another dimension of his hidden life involved his control over physical environments. Construction sites, open land, and highway projects created transient landscapes where soil was regularly moved, trenches were dug, and sites were constantly reshaped. Although no conclusive evidence has ever been found at these locations, investigators acknowledge that his occupation may have provided opportunities that few others possessed. This backdrop of normalcy, trust, and occupational access explains why Edwards avoided detection for so long. He did not fit the stereotypical image of a predator, and he leveraged that contrast to move freely within his community. His outward reliability created a veneer that concealed the darker realities later revealed through his own confessions. As authorities pieced together this portrait, they began to understand a troubling truth. The most dangerous individuals are not always those who appear threatening. Sometimes they are the ones who learn to blend in so effectively that their presence becomes unremarkable. In the case of Mack Ray Edwards, this ability to live unnoticed within plain sight delayed justice for years and left investigators with a complex challenge: how to differentiate between the life he presented and the life he concealed. When the criminal proceedings against Mack Ray Edwards began, one aspect of the case immediately stood out to prosecutors, the judge, and the broader public. Edwards did not behave like a typical defendant. He was not defensive, he was not evasive, he was not seeking leniency or a reduced sentence. Instead, he walked into the courtroom with a singular objective: to plead guilty and to be executed as quickly as possible. During pre-trial hearings, Edwards interrupted formal procedures by declaring, "Guilty, I am guilty." He insisted that the court impose the harshest penalty available. He went so far as to say, "I want the chair," referring to California's method of capital punishment at the time. For observers, this behavior was profoundly unsettling, not because guilt was in question, but because of how forcefully and repeatedly he demanded the ultimate punishment. Prosecutors later commented that his demeanor lacked any expectation of due process, almost as if the legal system was merely a formality delaying a fate he had already accepted. Yet, despite his insistence, criminal procedure requires structure, evidence, and deliberation. The court could not simply sentence a man to death because he requested it. Prosecutors had to establish the legal case, present the facts, and allow for a complete record. This created an unusual dynamic. The defense was obligated to ensure Edwards understood the consequences of his plea, while Edwards worked to accelerate the process at every step. Complicating matters were the inconsistencies embedded in his own confessions. In some statements, he claimed responsibility for 6 murders. At other times, he suggested the number could be as high as 18 or 20. He provided detailed accounts in one interview, only to contradict or walk back those statements days later. The ambiguity surrounding these admissions required investigators to separate verifiable information from speculation. This task proved challenging because some details matched known disappearances, while others contradicted established timelines. One particularly complex moment occurred when a letter surfaced after his death. Edwards had left the note with his wife, and its contents raised new questions. In it, he claimed he was responsible for the disappearance of 8-year-old Tommy Bowman, a case that had remained unsolved since 1957. Yet, in the same letter, he also stated he had committed only 1 murder and had falsely confessed to others to protect an unnamed paraplegic friend. Investigators found no evidence that such a person existed, nor did Edwards mention this alleged accomplice in any other context. The contradictions underscored why confessions, especially from serial offenders, must be treated with caution. Criminologists explain that offenders may provide misleading information for a variety of reasons: psychological distress, a desire to manipulate perception, or an attempt to maintain control over investigators even after surrendering. In Edwards' case, it remains unclear whether the inconsistencies reflected deliberate misdirection or internal conflict. His willingness to expose himself legally suggests remorse, while the contradictory statements imply a far more complex psychological landscape. During trial proceedings, Deputy District Attorney David Kenner emphasized the gravity of the crimes and the deliberate nature of the acts Edwards had confessed to. Kenner told the jury, "If ever there was a case that cried out for the imposition of the death penalty, this is the case." The prosecution argued not only for accountability, but also for recognition of the impact these unsolved disappearances had inflicted on families for years. Ultimately, Edwards was convicted of 3 murders, those of Stella Darlene Nolan, Gary Roche, and Donald Allen Todd. Despite confessing to more, he could only be formally charged in cases where sufficient evidence existed. This limitation meant that several families would never receive definitive closure. The courtroom chapter of this story concluded with the very outcome Edwards had demanded, a death sentence. Yet, even this resolution carried ambiguity. His inconsistent statements left unanswered questions about how many victims there truly were and whether additional confessions had been intentionally withheld. The legal process had delivered a verdict, but the full scope of his actions remained unclear. The court could only rule on what could be proven. Everything else, every uncertainty, every contradiction, would move with the case into its final chapter, the aftermath, the reinvestigations, and the lingering unanswered questions that continued to surround the name Mack Ray Edwards. Following his conviction, Mack Ray Edwards was transferred to San Quentin State Prison, where he awaited execution. His placement in the facility was itself a notable footnote in criminal history. Edwards was housed near some of California's most infamous offenders, including Charles Manson. Yet, unlike others on death row who filed appeals, challenged their sentences, or maintained innocence, Edwards showed no interest in prolonging his life or altering his circumstances. From the moment he entered the prison system, he continued to insist that the state carry out his execution as swiftly as possible. What emerged during this period was a pattern of escalating self-harm attempts. Edwards made multiple efforts to end his own life before the state could do so. Ultimately, on October 30, 1971, less than 2 years after his confession, he succeeded. Using a television cord in his cell, he took his own life. With that act, he effectively closed the door on any opportunity for further interrogation, additional clarification, or new confessions. He left behind more questions than answers. For investigators, the impact of his suicide was immediate and significant. Several of the cases he claimed involvement in were already decades old. Without Edwards available to confirm details, guide searches, or respond to inconsistencies, law enforcement had to rely solely on his earlier statements that were, at times, contradictory. The lack of physical evidence in several cases created a series of cold case obstacles that would challenge detectives for decades. Among the most persistent mysteries was the question of whether Edwards had more victims than those formally attributed to him. At one point, he claimed responsibility for as many as 20 deaths. At another, he reduced the number and insisted that several confessions were false. The letter he left with his wife added yet another layer of ambiguity. Incriminating in one paragraph and dismissive in the next, it left investigators uncertain which parts, if any, were truthful. These contradictions fueled ongoing inquiries into long unsolved disappearances across Southern California, particularly those involving children who vanished near construction zones or wooded areas where Edwards had worked. Over the years, search teams revisited multiple sites, often guided by historical maps and Edwards's vague references to locations. In some instances, cadaver detection dogs, forensic anthropologists, and excavation teams were deployed to areas where he had been employed during highway construction projects. One notable effort involved the search for the remains of 16-year-old Roger Dale Madison. Investigators used decades-old records to identify specific areas where Edwards had operated heavy equipment. With assistance from experts and law enforcement volunteers, they conducted methodical excavations in hopes of locating burial sites that had remained hidden beneath pavement, soil, and infrastructure built long after the crimes. Despite extensive efforts, no confirmed remains were found. This lack of resolution became a defining theme in the aftermath of the Edwards case. Families of missing children confronted a complex emotional landscape, relief that a potential explanation existed, but frustration that confirmation remained elusive. Edwards' confessions, while extensive, were not comprehensive enough to provide closure. Some families learned that Edwards had likely been involved in their child's disappearance. Others faced the possibility but had no evidence to support or refute it. For many, the ambiguity became its own form of trauma. Journalist Christine Pelisek, writing in 2008, described the Edwards case as one that cheated the victims' families in more ways than one. Not only were several children never found, but the one person who might have provided answers. Edwards himself had removed the possibility by ending his life before all questions could be asked. Criminologists studying the case highlight a key lesson. Confessions, even those delivered with apparent sincerity, cannot be accepted at face value. Some offenders confess to crimes they did not commit, while others obscure their involvement with mixed truths and omissions. Edwards' behavior sits at the intersection of these challenges. His admission solved some cases but raised new uncertainties for many others. Today, the name Mack Ray Edwards occupies a unique place in criminal history. He is one of the few serial offenders to voluntarily confess, demand the death penalty, and consistently portray himself as deserving of the harshest possible judgment. Yet, the shadow he cast remains broader than the cases legally tied to him. His suicide left a trail of unresolved investigations and a legacy of unanswered questions about his motives, about the true scope of his actions, and about the many families still searching for clarity. In the end, the Edwards case serves as a sobering reminder that some chapters in criminal history remain incomplete. Evidence fades, memories erode, and the individuals responsible sometimes deny the world its final answers. What remains is the responsibility to continue searching, investigating, and honoring the victims whose stories were left unfinished.